Adrian was the kind of man people noticed the moment he entered a room. Tall, charming, and confident, he carried himself with the aura of someone who had conquered the world. A self-made millionaire, his story was splashed across magazines and whispered about at dinner parties. To outsiders, his life was a living dream, a vast mansion on the edge of the city, a fleet of luxury cars, and invitations to every high-society gala. Yet the crown jewel of his perfect image was his wife, Elena. Elegant, soft-spoken, and admired for her grace, she was often described as the woman who had it all. But what most didn't know was what she had given up. Elena once had a promising career of her own, but she laid it aside to stand by Adrian, to support his ambitions, to be the anchor in his rising empire. Now, carrying his child, she seemed to complete the picture of a fairy tale marriage. Their love story, at least to the world, was flawless. Photographers caught them holding hands at charity balls, smiling on red carpets, and mingling with dignitaries. Newspapers ran features calling them the golden couple, a perfect blend of success and beauty. The mansion they lived in was a palace in its own right. Marble floors, glittering chandeliers, manicured gardens that seemed plucked out of a dream. To everyone watching, Adrian and Elena were untouchable. But behind the carefully crafted image, shadows had begun to creep in. It started subtly. Adrian's late nights at the office, at first explained away as dedication, soon grew longer and more frequent. He stopped joining Elena for dinners, preferring to take his meals alone in his study. His phone buzzed constantly with calls he would step outside to take, his voice low, his expression unreadable. Elena told herself it was business, the burden of wealth and success, but doubt gnawed at her heart. She noticed the way he avoided her gaze, how his kisses became brief, distracted, how the warmth that once wrapped around her seemed to slip away little by little. Carrying their unborn child, Elena tried to silence the unease growing inside her. She reminded herself of their vows, of the years they had spent building this life together. She held on to hope that whatever distance had come between them was temporary, that once the baby arrived, everything would change. Yet deep down, a whisper of fear lingered. Something was wrong. Something was coming. And though she could not see it yet, betrayal was already at her doorstep. Elena's life had once been filled with ambition, her days marked by deadlines, meetings, and the satisfaction of chasing her own dreams. She had been a bright presence in her field, respected for her intelligence and creativity. But when Adrian's empire began to grow, she chose to step away from her rising career, believing that her role was to support the man she loved. Friends told her she was selfless, society admired her devotion, and Adrian himself once praised her for being his pillar of strength. At the time, it felt worth it, trading her personal ambitions for the promise of a family and a future by his side. Yet now, as she carried their unborn child, those sacrifices weighed heavily on her, especially when she was left to face pregnancy mostly on her own. Her mornings began with quiet solitude, moving through the cavernous mansion that seemed too large for just her. The staff treated her with respect, but respect was not the same as companionship. She longed for Adrian's presence at the breakfast table, for his hand resting protectively on hers as it once did, but the chair across from her sat empty more often than not. Each passing day reminded her how much she had given, and how little she was receiving in return. The silence of the house was almost cruel, echoing back her loneliness. The physical toll of pregnancy only deepened her vulnerability. Nights were restless, filled with discomfort and the fear of raising her child in a world where her marriage no longer felt secure. She would sometimes place her hand over her belly, whispering to the little life inside her, promising that she would find strength even if she felt it slipping away. Tears would come quietly, never in public, always hidden from the world that believed her life was a dream. To outsiders, Elena was still radiant, glowing with the beauty of impending motherhood. But behind closed doors, she wept in silence, yearning for the man who seemed to be drifting further and further away. Still, she clung to hope. Every night, before she drifted into uneasy sleep, she prayed that Adrian would come back to her, that the sacrifices she had made would not be in vain, and that the love they once shared could be reignited for the sake of their unborn child. Adrian had mastered the art of wearing two faces. To the public, he was the embodiment of success, a generous businessman, a loving husband, a soon-to-be father who seemed to have everything a man could dream of. But beneath that polished exterior, another life had begun to take shape, one that Elena had no idea about. His rise to wealth had fed his appetite for more power, more excitement, more desire, and when Selena entered his world, she offered exactly that. Selena was nothing like Elena. Where Elena was gentle and reserved, Selena was bold, fiery, and unapologetic. She thrived in the nightlife, basked in attention, and knew how to use her beauty as leverage. Adrian met her during a business trip, their connection sparking like fire in a dark room. At first, he convinced himself it was harmless, a distraction, an escape from the pressure of responsibility. But soon the secret rendezvous became a habit, and the habit became an obsession. Expensive hotels, designer gifts, late-night dinners. He poured his wealth into keeping her satisfied, each indulgence pulling him further from the life he had built with Elena. In Selena's company, Adrian felt younger, freer, almost invincible. She flattered him, stroked his ego, and made him feel like a man unchained from duty. She whispered promises of passion and excitement, mocking the quiet, steady love Elena offered at home. It was intoxicating, and Adrian, blinded by desire, let himself believe he deserved it. After all, hadn't he worked hard enough to claim happiness in whatever form he chose? Yet deep inside, there was a flicker of unease. He avoided looking too closely at what he was doing, avoided thinking of Elena's sacrifices or the child growing inside her. He buried those thoughts under excuses. She would understand eventually, she would adapt, or maybe she would never need to know. In his mind, wealth gave him control, and control meant he could shape his world however he pleased. The lies piled up quickly, business trips that were really weekend getaways, phone calls he stepped outside to take, nights he returned home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't Elena's. The cracks in his marriage widened, and though Adrian noticed the sorrow in his wife's eyes, he hardened himself against it. To him, Selena was the future, and Elena was simply a chapter he believed he had outgrown. The day of betrayal came without warning. Though in Elena's heart she had sensed it drawing nearer like a storm on the horizon. Adrian returned home earlier than usual, his expression cold and calculated, his movements deliberate. For a fleeting moment, Elena felt a spark of hope. Perhaps he had finally come back to her, ready to reconnect, to be the man she remembered. But the moment he opened his mouth, the hope shattered into pieces she could never gather again. "Elena," he said, his voice sharp and distant. "This isn't working anymore. You need to leave." The words hung in the air like a blade. At first, she thought she had misheard him. Leave? In her fragile state, carrying his child, in the house where they had built their memories? She tried to laugh it off, tried to search his eyes for warmth, for the man she had once trusted. But Adrian didn't flinch. His face was set, his decision already made. Tears blurred Elena's vision as she pleaded, reminding him of their vows, of the life they had promised to build together. "Adrian, I gave up everything for you. I'm carrying your baby. How can you?" Her voice cracked, collapsing under the weight of disbelief. She reached for him, but he stepped back, his hands raised as if her touch were poison. "This isn't about you," he interrupted, his tone firm, almost rehearsed. "I need to be with someone who makes me feel alive again. You're not that person anymore." The cruelty of his words cut deeper than any blade. And then, as if to twist the knife, Selena appeared in the doorway, her figure poised and confident, her lips curved into a smirk that told Elena everything she needed to know. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was betrayal carefully planned, executed without hesitation. Elena's heart broke in that instant. She sobbed openly, clutching her belly as though shielding her unborn child from the pain she felt. She begged not for herself, but for the baby's future. "Please, Adrian. If not for me, then for our child. Don't do this." But Adrian didn't waver. With a glance at Selena, he turned his back and walked away, their hands entwined as they left the house together. Elena was left standing in the grand hallway of the mansion, the echo of their footsteps fading into silence, the world she had built crumbling around her. The mansion that had once been her sanctuary was no longer hers, and Elena found herself in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The marble floors, grand chandeliers, and sprawling gardens were replaced by cracked walls, squeaky doors, and a single bedroom barely large enough to hold the essentials. She sat on the edge of the worn-out sofa, staring at the silence that surrounded her, feeling as if her life had been stripped away piece by piece. Gone was the woman admired for her elegance. In her place stood someone forced to rebuild from nothing. The financial strain was immediate. Though Adrian had once showered her with luxury, he left her with little to survive on. Every trip to the grocery store became an exercise in budgeting, choosing the cheapest vegetables, calculating the cost of milk, debating whether she could afford prenatal vitamins. Medical checkups for her pregnancy, once attended with ease and private doctors, now required waiting hours in crowded clinics. Each appointment was a reminder of how far she had fallen, not just in wealth but in the security she once believed unshakable. Nights were the hardest. She would sit by the small window, the city lights blinking in the distance, and think about the home she had lost. Memories of dinners shared with Adrian, laughter that once filled the mansion, and the dreams they had whispered about the future haunted her like ghosts. Sometimes she would clutch her belly, whispering to her unborn child, promising that despite everything, she would not let despair win. Her tears flowed quietly, not of weakness, but of heartbreak and the crushing loneliness of being abandoned. And yet, in those dark moments, a flicker of resilience began to burn within her. Though she had been cast aside, though she carried the weight of betrayal, she refused to collapse entirely. Every sacrifice she had made, every tear she shed, strengthened her resolve. She would endure this exile, not just for herself, but for the tiny heartbeat inside her. She vowed that her child would one day know love, stability, and strength, even if she had to fight alone to provide it. Margaret, Adrian's mother, had always been a woman of sharp instincts. She had watched her son climb to the heights of success, and though she was proud of his achievements, she knew how easily ambition could blind a man. When she visited the mansion one evening, she noticed details that unsettled her: the absence of Elena's belongings, the coldness in Adrian's voice when her name was mentioned, and the presence of a new woman in the background. Selina greeted Margaret with a smile that was too polished, too practiced. Her words were sweet, but her eyes carried calculation. Margaret, who had spent a lifetime reading people, was not fooled. At first, she tried to speak with Adrian directly. "Where is Elena?" she asked over dinner, her fork resting untouched on the plate. Adrian brushed it off with a shrug, muttering something vague about needing space, about Elena being too much to handle during her pregnancy. His dismissal made Margaret's blood run cold. Elena, the woman who had given up everything for him, the one carrying his child, was now being spoken of as if she were disposable. Margaret pressed further, but Adrian grew defensive, his words laced with irritation. It was then she realized something far darker was at play. Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret sought Elena out. When she arrived at the small apartment, the sight that greeted her broke her heart. Elena, once radiant and full of quiet strength, now looked fragile, her face pale and tired, her body weighed down not only by pregnancy but by sorrow. The elegant dresses she used to wear were replaced by simple clothes, and the sparkle in her eyes was gone. Margaret listened as Elena, through tears, revealed everything: how Adrian had cast her out, how Selina had taken her place, how she was struggling to survive. Anger surged through Margaret like fire. She had raised her son better than this, and to see him betray his wife and unborn child filled her with both rage and shame. But alongside that fury came resolve. She reached out, holding Elena's trembling hands, and whispered, "You are not alone in this. I will not let him destroy you." In that moment, Margaret's role shifted from mother to protector, ready to confront Adrian and shield Elena from further pain. Margaret wasted no time confronting her son. She arrived at his office unannounced, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor as though each step carried the weight of judgment. Adrian looked up from behind his polished desk, clearly irritated by the interruption, but the irritation quickly turned to discomfort when he saw the expression in his mother's eyes. There was no warmth, no softness, only controlled fury. "I've spoken with Elena," Margaret began, her tone steady but laced with fire. "I know everything you've done. You cast out your pregnant wife, the mother of your child, to live in misery while you parade around with that woman. She didn't need to mention Selina by name, her disdain was obvious. Adrian leaned back in his chair, feigning calm, though his jaw tightened. Mother, you don't understand. Elena wasn't enough for me anymore. I needed someone who made me feel alive again. Selina, she does that. She gives me something Elena never could. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. Alive? You think betrayal is life? You think abandoning your wife and child is freedom? What you call happiness is nothing but destruction. The exchange grew heated, with Adrian raising his voice, insisting he had a right to choose his own happiness, while Margaret reminded him of his responsibilities, his vows, and the child whose future he was jeopardizing. For every excuse he gave, she countered with truth, cutting through his selfish reasoning like a knife. But Adrian was stubborn, his pride refusing to yield. Finally, Margaret stood, her voice lower now but filled with warning. Adrian, you are blinded by lust and arrogance. But mark my words, what you're chasing will ruin you. And when it does, you will realize too late what you have thrown away. Her words lingered in the air, long after she left his office. Adrian sat in silence, trying to shake off the sting of her judgment, but a shadow of doubt crept into his thoughts. Still, he brushed it aside, convinced that his mother was simply old-fashioned, unable to understand the life he wanted. He had no idea that her warning was not a threat, but a promise of what was to come. Elena sat quietly in her small apartment one rainy afternoon when a knock sounded at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, her heart leapt with anxiety. But when she opened it, she found Margaret standing there, holding an envelope and a small polished key in her hand. The older woman stepped inside, her presence filling the modest space with warmth and authority all at once. Elena, overwhelmed by the visit, struggled to hold back her tears. She had grown accustomed to being alone, to facing every battle in silence, and the sight of someone arriving not to judge her, but to stand by her was almost too much to bear. Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the envelope on the table and pressed the key into Elena's trembling palm. This, she said firmly, belongs to you now. That house, the one you built your life in, the one where you should be raising your child, it is yours. Adrian may think he has replaced you, but I will not allow him to erase you. Elena stared down at the key, unable to speak. A flood of memories filled her mind, laughter in the grand dining hall, evenings spent walking through the gardens, quiet mornings when she had once felt safe. To think that those spaces might once again be hers, not as a guest or an outcast but as the rightful lady of the house, was almost too overwhelming to believe. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "But why would you do this for me? I am not your daughter." Margaret's eyes softened. She reached out and cupped Elena's face, her voice steady with conviction. "You are the mother of my grandchild. You are the woman who stood by my son when he had nothing and helped him build everything. If anyone deserves that mansion, it is you, not the woman who has poisoned his heart." The following days were a blur. With Margaret's help, Elena returned to the mansion, each step echoing like a reclamation of her dignity. Standing in the grand hallway once again, she felt a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. What had once been a place of heartbreak was now transformed into a symbol of resilience. She was no longer the woman cast out in shame. She was the mother who would raise her child with pride, armed not with wealth alone, but with love and the unshakable support of the woman who had just handed her the keys to her new beginning. Adrian believed he had won. With Selina on his arm and Elena out of the picture, he strutted through his social circles with the confidence of a man who thought he controlled his own destiny. At first, everything seemed intoxicating, lavish parties, exotic trips, and nights filled with passion. Selina fed his ego, reminding him constantly of how powerful, how desirable, how untouchable he was. But the illusion didn't last. The cracks in his new life appeared quickly, sharper and more devastating than he could have imagined. Selina, who once seemed like a thrilling escape, revealed her true nature the moment she felt secure in her position. She was not interested in Adrian's heart, only his wealth. She demanded designer wardrobes, new cars, and extravagant vacations, her appetite insatiable. When he hesitated, she grew cold, threatening to leave him if he didn't deliver. The passion that once fueled their affair was replaced with endless demands, her charm dissolving into manipulation. For the first time, Adrian felt the sting of being used. At the same time, his business empire began to falter. Deals that had once come easily slipped through his fingers, investors grew wary of his distracted behavior, and whispers of his scandalous personal life began spreading through elite circles. The same society that once applauded him now turned their backs. Invitations to prestigious galas stopped arriving, and headlines shifted from praising his success to exposing his betrayal. He had traded stability for chaos, respect for scandal. Adrian began to feel the walls closing in. He returned home one evening to find Selina entertaining friends in his mansion, laughing as though she owned the place. When he confronted her, she scoffed, reminding him that without her, he was nothing but a lonely man clinging to wealth that was slipping away. The realization cut deep. He had sacrificed his marriage, his reputation, and his peace of mind for someone who saw him only as a wallet. As the empire he built crumbled around him, regret began to gnaw at his soul. He thought of Elena, of the nights she had waited for him, of the sacrifices she made without complaint. For the first time, he wondered if he had destroyed the only real love he had ever known. But the damage was done. While he sank deeper into ruin, Elena was rising, supported by the very person he had taken for granted his whole life, his mother. The day Elena gave birth was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The sterile walls of the hospital room melted away as soon as she heard the tiny cry of her baby. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the nurse placed the newborn in her arms, the warmth of that fragile little body filling the hollowness that had haunted her for months. In that moment, she felt stronger than she had ever felt before. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the loneliness, none of it mattered when she looked into her child's eyes. She whispered promises into the baby's ear, vows of protection, love, and resilience. Her suffering had forged her into someone unbreakable, and now she had a new purpose: to build a better future. Back at the mansion, life slowly transformed. Margaret stood firmly by her side, guiding her not only as a mother-in-law but as a true ally. Together, they filled the house with life again. Rooms that once echoed with emptiness were now filled with laughter, lullabies, and warmth. The mansion, which had been a symbol of betrayal and heartbreak, became a sanctuary, a place where Elena's child would grow surrounded by love, stability, and dignity. Elena began to rebuild more than just her home. Drawing from her own struggles, she started a foundation dedicated to helping single mothers who had been abandoned or betrayed. The cause resonated deeply with her, and soon her name was on the lips of many, not as the millionaire's discarded wife, but as a woman of strength who turned her pain into a mission. Her story inspired others, proving that strength is born in the darkest of times. Meanwhile, Adrian watched from afar as the empire he had sacrificed everything for continued to collapse. Society no longer admired him, investors pulled away, and even Selina eventually abandoned him for someone richer, leaving him hollow and alone. The mansion that had once been his pride now belonged to the woman he had cast aside. Elena no longer needed his validation, his money, or his presence. She had risen above him. As she rocked her baby to sleep one evening, Elena looked around the home that was hers again and smiled softly. She had been broken, but she had not been destroyed. Instead, she had rebuilt herself stronger than ever. The betrayal that was meant to crush her had instead become the spark for her triumph.